Today is September 16th, and I wanted to talk about agency relationships, agency disclosures, representing buyers and sellers, how to show representation if you are working in a team or with a co-agent, and then talk about how we're going to be disclosing our relationship to all parties of our transaction. And then at the very end, getting to
Your
the...
fate's better.
What was that? No? Okay. Um, Getting to the finish line. So for the first part of this, in order to know who we represent, we need to look back at our agency law. Now, we all know that as brokers, we're required to give this real estate brokerage in Washington pamphlet to all of the people we interact with. These are people who we don't necessarily represent. An unrepresented buyer would receive this real estate pamphlet, as well as anybody that we do have an agency relationship or a contract with. And explaining in this, we want to also tell them the purpose of this and how our agency relationship works. Part of this right here, part of this right here too, does show that we as brokers are not working solely by ourselves. We are going to be supervised by our firm, and we are going to be supervised by a managing broker or a designated broker of that firm who does enforce all the rules of the Department of Licensing in Washington. So the agency law requires that a broker gives a copy of the pamphlet before their client receives or signs any service agreement. There are no exceptions, and this is what the RCW states. A broker owes the following duties to their principal and all parties in a transaction, which may not be waived. Number one, you need to provide the pamphlet as described by this RCW and obtain an acknowledgement of receipt by that party. This means we can have a confirmation email. If you do this through Transaction Desk, there is a way for you to get confirmation of the receipt if you send it as a read only. And we are required to give it to any party who we give real estate services to as soon as reasonably practical, but before a service agreement is signed. Now, in this, I did want to point out too that not only do we disclose our agency relationship, but we also have this neat little paragraph in here that just reassures our clients that each of the brokers who is working for them is working under the responsibility of a designated broker and the oversight of a firm. And those firms can have branch managers. And the reason this paragraph is important is because there is a space in our agreements that does point out the fact that a firm may have an overseeing broker who might work as a dual agent. But more so, it's just to disclose fully who the parties are in a transaction. And the broker that supervises you is technically somebody who may be acting on the behalf of the principal client. So single party representation. This means you have an agreement that's signed by a buyer or a seller. We know that we need to stay loyal. We need to always disclose conflicts of interest to our principal, advise them to seek an expert if we need to. Most importantly on this, though, is number 4, not to disclose any confidential information about the principal, and to make the good faith and continuous effort to work on their behalf. So for a buyer, this would be to continually find properties, and for a seller, it would be to continually try to get offers. Now, oh gosh, sorry, that's not the right slide. I don't know what I clicked there. Sorry, we have a long way to go before that slide comes up. Now, here. Now, for limited dual agents, this is a paragraph that I think is going to come up more and more with the new law of needing to sign our buyer broker agreement before we can even show a house. If you have somebody who is working in a dual agent capacity, I highlighted number 1 and number 4 because they're the hardest ones to kind of keep separated, right? Number 1 says we are to take no action. I'm getting a little bit of noise. Somebody who's not muted. I'm gonna mute. Sorry, I'm gonna mute everybody if that's all right. just to make sure. Mute.
I got you, Jen. I did it.
Thank you. So number one is to take no action that is detrimental or adverse to the principal's interest in a transaction. This means if you represent a buyer and the seller at the same time, you can do nothing that actually puts the other one at a disadvantage. Also, I'm going to skip down to number 4 because most of us are pretty familiar with the rest of our duties here. But number 4 says not to disclose any confidential information about either principal. The principal is the person who you've signed the agreement with. So if you've signed a dual agency agreement, you are a limited dual agent because you are limited in the capacity that you cannot share information confidentially, and you cannot do anything that is a detriment to the other party. Where's mine? There we go. So thinking about the basic rules, and then we'll go into how these things play out in real life. The basic rules are you represent the person that you have a written agreement to represent. And you need to represent at least one party. So if you represent a seller only, you can represent that seller in either a listing agreement, or you can represent that seller with a seller representation agreement, which is an off-market sort of for sale by owner where you are representing seller. In the buyer agreement, you're going to represent a buyer by a 41, which is the buyer broker agreement. Now, there has been some chatter that some other firms have maybe done what they call a touring agreement. And the important thing to remember is that a touring agreement is not going to be consistent with the Washington state law. There are certain provisions that have to be written out in an agreement before we show buyers homes, and a touring agreement won't necessarily cover all of those things. So showing homes is the provision of real estate brokerage services, and it has to have a clear agreement with your client. It says right here, showing homes is the provision of real estate services, and Washington law is very clear that a broker must enter a service agreement with a client before, I'm going to take out or as soon as reasonably practical, because with the NAR settlement, we know that that portion has been eliminated. Before you provide real estate services, you have to enter an agreement. A touring agreement is not an agreement. So I just wanted to pull up the couple agreements that we'll be referencing throughout the rest of this class. Number 1 on the left is the buyer service agreement, and the one on the right is the exclusive listing agreement. For the buyer service agreement, keep in mind the term that you write down right here is the term that you are going to be actively providing the services that you've promised. This means you're going to actively be searching for homes, and you're going to be continually engaging in conversation and following up with this client. So this is something that you should keep in mind if you're going to put 365 days. That means for an entire year, you need to actually do your part too, which is to keep actively finding them properties. Now, with our showings requiring the buyer service agreement to be done before, this is a flexible space where we could write something shorter. And that's all going to be a case-by-case basis on the client you choose to help at the time. For the pamphlet, we want to make sure, agency, we want to make sure that we are giving the pamphlet. And keeping in mind the buyer broker that's written in on line 13 where it says buyer broker is going to be the broker who is providing those real estate services. Okay, now how to show who we represent. A team leader is not a supervising broker unless that leader has received authority through a written delegation agreement. So if you are working with a team of people, your team leader, unless they have been given a written agreement to supervise the brokers in that team, is not going to be acting in that limited dual agent capacity. They are just going to be seen in this situation as another real estate broker. If a team leader does not have that delegated supervisory authority and they are serving as an agent of the firm, then the leader has to be included in the agreement that you write up. So this would be an example of people who work on a team. If that team leader is going to be involved in any of the real estate transactions, you need to identify that team leader on your seller agreement or buyer agreement. And if you have not already done so, you can amend it with I'm sorry, it's supposed to be 41A. Now, if the leader is providing a mentoring to the broker only, so they're just giving advice, this would be a managing broker role, and they're not representing the client. There is no requirement to include them in any of the agency agreements. You do not need to disclose them anywhere. They're more of an advisory. They are not working directly with the client. So they do not need disclosure. So putting that down pen to paper. This right here would be where you put a team name if you are a full team, or you would list out individual team members who are helping right here. Again, it depends how your team is set up, and I don't know if I can think of a quick example of when a team name would be used versus multiple brokers. Limited dual agency is going to be what you consent to if the named people in this agreement are also the named people on the other side of the transaction. For a firm limited dual agent, so somebody in a supervisory role, like I'll use, I guess, myself as an example. I am an advisor for people in the offices. So if two agents in the same transaction are from my office and they're both asking me questions about the transaction, I will be working in a limited dual capacity because I am helping both sides of the transaction with their questions. But I don't need to be named on the purchase and sale or in any sort of agreement between the client and the agent because of my role being advisory only and not party of the transaction. If you have multiple team members, say somebody is going to be your showing agent, or somebody is going to be your door opener, or somebody is going to be providing some sort of real estate services, then you would put them in the other category on the second page. This is the listing agreement. So if you have somebody there who's going to be potentially talking to the sellers about any negotiation tactics or anything, they definitely need to be on here. Anybody who interacts with the client needs to be on this form. This would be a great place too if you have a licensed transaction coordinator who is going to be interacting with the client. You can put them right here in the other. Yes, Heidi.
So Jen, if we are co-listing, we would just list both names on that first page as the firm appoints, or would we put the co-lister here?
You can do it in either place, because what you're doing is you're just acknowledging that there are two brokers that are going to be providing real estate services. So they just both need to be on this form somewhere as a co-list.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay. When you're working with buyers, the same thing applies. So any buyer who you're providing real estate services to needs to be listed here. This could be a husband and wife, or maybe a couple people who are buying a home together. Anybody who's going to be part of that transaction needs to be on this buyer service agreement. So again, the agent who's helping them is going to be you. Your name goes in that broker space. But the important thing I wanted to point out here is that if there are multiple buyers need to be listed on here, as well as signing this entire agreement. If there are multiple brokers, broker number one and broker number two, as Heidi was saying, can be squeezed into this one space. And if there's not enough room, you can put that in the other, or you can add an amendment with a 41A and write that in the other there. The takeaway from this is that any broker who is providing those services needs to be listed as representing, because we need to look at these things as a contract of representation, not the disclosure of representation. So our first part is to get this contract signed between the client and the brokers that they have the right to represent them. And then looking forward into the transaction, once the transaction has been put together, we're going to disclose to the other parties who represents whom. Again, this other space can be used if we have showing brokers or if there's anybody in here not needing additional compensation. We want to make sure not to make a second buyer broker agreement for a second broker, because that would obligate that client then to pay 2 broker fees. So if you are working with somebody in our office, and I will address outside of our office shortly, but within our office, then the broker goes here. There is a situation where you're going to need to have a second one written if you're working with a co-broker who is outside your office. And that's right here. So co-representing with another firm. This would also be a great place for you to co-represent if you have somebody from, say, the Vashon office wanting to co-represent with somebody from the Mukilteo office. If you have 2 representations outside the firm, you're going to need to think a little bit wider on how to write this up so we have 2 agreements in place. So I'm going to pose the question and I'll go through the answer and why, and then show how to write that up. So think about this. A broker is sharing a buyer broker or a buyer with a broker from another firm. If they get 2 Form 41s and put $5,000 on one and $5,000 on the other, because they intend to evenly split $10,000 in commission, is that going to be an issue since you cannot collect compensation, more compensation than that's listed on the buyer broker agreement? Or should they both have 41s and mark non-exclusive to put $10,000 on each? So how does a broker from firm A and a broker from firm B each get paid $5,000, and on the purchase and sale agreement, note that $10,000 is going to be paid? There's a couple different ways we can do this. So if we have 2 exclusive Form 41s, each representing an obligation for that buyer to pay $5,000, then that means the buyer will owe a total of $10,000 to the buyer brokers. So there's no reason that the buyer couldn't ask the seller to pay the $10,000, because that's their obligation, to the buyer brokers, and also instruct escrow on how to split that evenly between the 2 firms. So option 1 is to have a Form 41 for each firm, each one obligating that buyer to pay $5,000. And because it's going to be split, the $10,000 can be asked for on the purchase and sale. We're allowed to ask for it because the buyer does hold an obligation to paying that. And then in our escrow instructions, which would be on our Form 40s, we would instruct escrow to split that via the way the buyer agreements have been laid out, 5 and 5. They could also have one of the firms sign the buyer broker agreement for $10,000 exclusively, and then the other one sign a non-exclusive for $10,000 with an agreement between the 2 firms as to how to share that compensation. So this one's a little bit trickier though, because brokers, you're going to have to make sure that you have good communication and instruct how to split that. And you're going to have to heavily rely on the person who's writing that up. Basically, both of these approaches can be done, giving the total of $10,000 split between the 2 firms. So if you're going to split representation between 2 firms, you can either do 2 representation agreements exclusively, splitting it evenly, or however you split it. You can do 1 non-exclusive and 1 exclusive. Or also at the end of the day, you can just do a referral agreement if you choose to do it that way. There are different implications though by doing a referral agreement versus doing a co-list when it comes to tracking your sales. So both of these approaches would allow the purchase of $10,000 to be paid out to the two firms. Single agency relationships. These are the most simple ones that we probably do the most. In our single agency relationship, it's just our contracts that we're used to between the client and the agent. This one right here is an exclusive listing agreement. So again, it would be just all sellers who are listed on there and any brokers who are going to be representing that sale on the Northwest MLS. If your name is on this page, your name is also going to be on the input sheet, and it's also going to be listed on the Northwest MLS. And then at the end of the sale, it will also be paid out from escrow. So for people or for agents who are co-listing, you'll want to make sure that your name is on all of those places. Your name is going to be on the listing agreement, input sheet, Northwest MLS, and disclosed in the purchase and sale. I do look for those things when I check. So if I notice that there is one broker listed on the listing agreement, but two brokers listed in the sale, I will be asking for an amendment showing that that seller gave consent to have the second broker represent them. Compensation, this is just part of the listing agreement here. I actually didn't really want to talk too much about compensation, but what I did want to talk about on this is the unrepresented buyer category. Now, as listing agents, we are signing this listing agreement with the intention that we are going to work for our sellers to do everything we can to sell their home. Now, we know in our real estate law and our agency duties to our clients, we need to work tirelessly to find them any and all buyers who are ready, willing, and able. That means compensation that's listed also includes the provision that you are going to be willing to show an unrepresented buyer this home. Keep in mind, if you do work with an unrepresented buyer, we have limitations on what we can and cannot do. The percentage or dollar amount that you choose to agree on with your client on section 7AII should take into consideration the complications that may come up from helping an unrepresented buyer. And this would be a great opportunity to talk to your seller about how a transaction like that may unfold. This is all negotiable again, but the seller should be aware of the differences of a buyer coming with representation versus without representation. Now, if you are assisting in any real estate services, co-listing, being a door opener for no additional compensation, and what I mean by no additional is what you've listed in pop-ups. What you've listed right here as listing firm compensation is the amount that seller is going to pay the listing firm. Remember, the seller hires the firm and you are an agent of the firm. So if there's somebody who's going to be helping you as a door opener or anything else for no additional compensation from that seller, they can be listed right here in the other. The unrepresented buyer. Unrepresented buyers mean there is no buyer agreement, there is no seller agreement. They could be for sale by owner or a buyer who just doesn't want to sign with an agent. These things happen, and we're going to keep seeing these pop up. So how do we work with people who don't want an agent? Well, number one, we need to disclose our agency relationship. We need to give them the pamphlet, of course, but we also need to fully disclose what that means to that buyer if their buyer is unrepresented, or even the seller for a FSBO. We need to disclose that in the purchase and sale agreement. In fact, our law says we have to disclose who represents whom in our contracts. Now, our Northwest MLS contracts, anytime you use any one of our forms, we already have a space that shows representation, and that's the disclosure we need. So there's no need to bring additional forms in like this one right here. I brought the 42 because it says agency disclosure, which can be really confusing. But this form is for contracts who don't already disclose who represents whom. So this would be a form that you might want to use for, say, a builder contract. It's not going to show that you represent any party in the builder contract necessarily. If it's unlisted in there, you want to bring this form up. Otherwise, this is not a form that belongs in any one of our purchase and sale agreements. Instead, we have the ability to use, in this one, line 16, this is form 21. In line 16, we can disclose our agency relationship by just clicking 2 boxes. Now, I use the examples below. Joe Smith is buyer broker from ABC firm, and Carrie Smith is, sorry for the same last names, Carrie Smith is from the real firm. So both being separate firms, separate representations. When you list your name on the buyer broker side, you are acknowledging that you are representing the buyer broker. So in this case, each one would represent each party as bullet pointed up above in line 16. Now, if you have 2 people from the same firm and one of them happens to be the designated broker overseeing the transactions, or a team leader who is supervising a member of the team, then that would be a situation where technically they would be a dual agent because Joe Smith oversees Gary Fisher. So there is privileged knowledge that Joe Smith has over Gary Fisher in negotiations, and just can't use the knowledge that's obtained from the ability to access it. So we don't really have a lot of those situations within our office itself, although we do have several brokers here who have a managing broker's license that doesn't always put you into a limited dual agent situation. It's only when you have the supervisory power over all of the transactions, because at the end of the day, if you can look up the information and see things that may be detrimental to that client, then you need to hold yourself in a capacity that doesn't allow that to happen. In our purchase and sale agreements, we also want to make sure that we're using 42A to disclose multiple brokers. If you cannot fit the brokers on the purchase and sale agreement page, which you can't really fit more than one anyway, any additional brokers should be noted in 42A. This is only a disclosure. So this in itself is not necessarily enough to say that you have a signed agency relationship to represent a seller. It's just telling the other party that when or if this person is involved in any communication, their stance is representing whichever party is checked. This would also be a place that's appropriate for you to write in your licensed transaction coordinator. Any unlicensed transaction coordinator does not need to be put in there because that person will not be interacting with your clients directly. But anytime you do have direct communication, it is only fair that the party in communication knows who is being represented when you talk to that person. So how does this translate to your CDA? And so I use the term CDA, but it's the Form 40, the CDF compensation disbursement form. Well, the name on here means if your name is on this form, it means you have a buyer agreement in place with your name on it, a seller agreement in place with your name on it, or a referral form. There's going to be some paper trail that shows that you had a representation agreement and that you are being allowed to be paid. If not, you should amend, sorry, my typo, you should amend to say so, or receive no payment. Because if we think back to the law that changed in January, it's all brokers must have a written agreement to receive compensation. In this, I just wanted to close up this, the buyer broker firm. You would be listed down below, not necessarily listed on this. Sometimes this is just signed by the transaction coordinator. This is the communication to escrow, but it is what I check to make sure that you have all the rest of the documents in place. So this is just one of those check boxes. When you're double checking your buyer compensation or seller compensation, you should be checking it yourself before you sign off, noting anything that doesn't look right. And then as a catch, I do double and triple check it. So hopefully by the time the sale closes, it's gone through at least 3 or 4 different sets of eyes. Listing firm as well. If your name is on the listing side, I'm also going to make sure that you are a listing broker or that you have some sort of an agreement to represent the listing side before all of this is turned green. So what does your representation actually mean? There are some different agency scenarios that I wanted to Q&A here. I thought these were really interesting. If I'm the listing agent and a buyer wants to represent themselves, do I need a signed buyer agreement? What if the buyer refuses to sign an agency agreement? Do I have to show them the home? And for those of us who are at the sales meeting, we know it's not necessary because the broker is a listing agent. The broker represents the seller and already has a brokerage agreement with that seller. So the broker does not need to represent the buyer. Now, because the listing broker does not represent the buyer and does not intend to represent the buyer, the listing broker should definitely not have a buyer agreement with that buyer. Listing broker is free to show the unrepresented buyer the property without entering a brokerage agreement with that buyer. If the unrepresented buyer wants to purchase the listing broker must deliver the pamphlet. They must disclose to that buyer that the buyer is unrepresented and complete the agency disclosure provision on the purchase and sale agreement to indicate that the listing broker represents the seller exclusively and the buyer is unrepresented. This may translate to our open houses, and listing brokers may be getting more phone calls for those for those buyers who don't want to sign an agreement. So keep that in mind. Keep your ears and eyes open for that. And I appreciate you listening, and I'd love to talk about maybe some more scenarios where you have found yourself as buyer broker or listing broker and maybe questioned how you've done your paperwork. So thanks for listening.